Medieval food was basically punishment. During the Middle Ages, it seems like there was a lot of delicious-looking food around. There were savory stews, fresh loaves of bread, sweet pastries and pies filled with fruit. But behind that facade of a feast fit for a king was some really nasty stuff. So let us take a deep dive into medieval cooking and find out why eating during the Dark Ages was basically punishment. Meat or the lack thereof. Milk was another food that spoiled fast back in the day. Without modern tech, keeping it fresh was a challenge. It was a big part of the medieval diet, but honestly, it wasn't always safe to drink, which meant that perishables like meat and dairy went bad quickly. This also applied to sugar. Sugar came to Europe from the Middle East. Back then, it was harvested by hand in Egypt and India. Then it was shipped over land, which made it expensive and rare. Would you rather starve? So let us jump right into some of the most interesting facts about what people ate during this time period. Sounds wild, right? Back then, molds were seen as harmless, even helpful. They were munching on that moldy cheese raw. They even spread mold on fresh cheese by using something called cheese combs. Can you picture combing through your cheese, making sure every little hole is packed with mold? Yikes! It sounds pretty gross, doesn't it? Without modern tech, keeping it fresh was a challenge. It was a big part of the medieval diet, but honestly, it wasn't always safe to drink. Cows grazed on contaminated grass and lived in dirty stables, so the milk often ended up tainted with all sorts of nasty stuff. Even if it looked fine, it would spoil eventually, and there was no real way to tell when. It could sit out for days before someone decided to drink it, and by then, it was usually sour and curdled, dumping waste right into the water. So if you wanted to stay safe and drink during the Middle Ages, boiling was definitely the way to go. And only the wealthy could afford to use it to season their food. Because of this, salt was sometimes used as a form of currency. It was also common for people to pay workers with salt instead of coins. People would carefully measure out their salt and use it on only some of their food. Other times, they would simply eat their food with no seasoning at all. Back then, there were no supermarkets to buy inexpensive salt, so people had to get creative. People would collect the salt that was left over after boiled cabbage, beets, or fish. They would also gather salt from spring runoff that naturally evaporated in salty ponds. Even though these methods were not sanitary, people were willing to do anything to get their hands on salt. Salt was believed to preserve food, so people would store it next to their meat. This wasn't entirely true, but people were willing to risk spoiling their food for a chance at having some salt. They let cheese develop a layer of mold to keep other nasty bacteria away. I hope you enjoyed learning about some of the things that people ate during this time period. If you liked this video, check out my last video on what life was like in the Middle Ages. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button to join our growing community. Thanks for watching. They were more prone to diseases that could find their way into the milk. So people often had to drink unpasteurized milk, which was risky. Imagine drinking someone else's spoiled milk. Yikes. Tossing in cheap, easy-to-store turnips. They were so popular that there was even a saying, "Turnips, a dish for kings." But after a while, people got sick of them. Legend has it that during King Henry VIII's reign, folks were so fed up with turnips that they actually petitioned him to ban them. Can you imagine? Everyone loves a bit of variety in their meals, and it turns out medieval folks were no different. That was a reality in the Middle Ages. Milk often went to market with other goods, making it easy for thieves to swipe it. If caught, they faced harsh punishments, sometimes even being locked in a room with just the stolen milk to drink. Can you picture how awful that would be? The idea was that if you cut off the moldy part, the cheese would go bad. Meanwhile, the common folks had it rough. Medieval peasants mostly ate boiled meat, think beef, mutton, pork, or veal. But here's the kicker. Most water sources were right next to human and animal waste. Animals would do their business near the water. And since people shared these sources, they got contaminated too. Wells were dug close to homes, often tainted by waste from nearby outhouses. But here's the kicker. That meat often sat around for days before cooking, which meant it was usually crawling with maggots and smelled awful. Yikes! Plus, the butchering process wasn't exactly sanitary. Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more nutty history. Because of this, sugar was a luxury item and most people never saw it. But there was one type of sugar that was available to everyone, honey. Honey didn't spoil the way that sugar did. It was made by bees, so it was seen as a natural sweetener. It was used in baking and to flavor drinks. Take blue cheese, for example. Molds like Aspergillus niger and Penicillium roqueforti are key players in that deliciousness. These molds can be toxic, which is why some cheeses need to be cooked before eating. This meant that people could enjoy something sweet without worrying about getting a stomachache from spoiled sugar. Cows grazed on contaminated grass and lived in dirty stables, so the milk often ended up tainted with all sorts of nasty stuff. When fish went bad, it was soaked in vinegar to mask the odor. During the Middle Ages, fish was often kept in vinegar brine, and it was done for two reasons. First, vinegar is acidic and can help preserve food by inhibiting the growth of bacteria. Secondly, the strong smell of vinegar could overpower any unpleasant smells coming from the fish. In addition to soaking fish in vinegar, people also used herbs like bay leaves and rosemary to cover up the smell of spoiled meat. While we can see why they did this, do you think the smell of rosemary or bay leaf would be able to overpower the stench of spoiled fish? Let me know in the comments. Even if it looked fine, it would spoil eventually, and there was no real way to tell when. Today, finding a maggot in your muffin would put an end to your appetite immediately. But back then, they just removed them and continued baking. Flour was bought and sold by weight, and dishonest millers would adulterate their flour by throwing in whatever they had available, including plaster, bones, sawdust, and yes, even the occasional dead animal. To combat this issue, merchants would inspect the flour before purchasing it. They would sift it through a sieve with large holes so that the contaminants would fall through. The flour was then saved and used to make bread. This practice led to flour being referred to as the, quote, meal of the month. While this was an attempt to save money, I don't think I would want to eat someone else's lunch, no matter how desperate I was. Without modern tech, keeping it fresh was a challenge. It was a big part of the medieval diet. They were more prone to diseases that could find their way into the milk. So, people often had to drink unpasteurized milk, which was risky. Imagine drinking someone else's spoiled milk. Yikes. That was a reality in the Middle Ages. Milk often went to market with other goods, making it easy for thieves to swipe it. If caught, they faced harsh punishments, sometimes even being locked in a room with just the stolen milk to drink. Can you picture how awful that would be? But honestly, it wasn't always safe to drink. Cows grazed on contaminated grass and lived in dirty stables, so the milk often ended up tainted with all sorts of nasty stuff. Even if it looked fine, it would spoil eventually, and there was no real way to tell when. It could sit out for days before someone decided to drink it, and by then, it was usually sour and curdled. It could sit out for days before someone decided to drink it, and by then, it was usually sour and curdled. Getting fresh milk in cities was tricky too. Not only was food often grossly contaminated, but it could also be stolen or spoiled. And if it wasn't contaminated, spoiled, or stolen, it might just plain taste bad. With all of this in mind, it is no wonder that people in the Middle Ages often wished for something sweet, like a piece of pie or a freshly baked apple tart. But if they were lucky enough to get it, it would probably be filled with worms. Life during the Middle Ages was full of surprises, but one thing was for sure, you never knew what you were going to get when you sat down to dinner. Whether it was sawdust cake or dog meat, the medieval peasant and nobility alike had to face their fears and dig in. They were more prone to diseases that could find their way into the milk. So, people often had to drink unpasteurized milk, which was risky. Meanwhile, the common folks had it rough. Medieval peasants mostly ate boiled meat, think beef, mutton, pork, or veal. But here's the kicker, that meat often sat around for days before cooking, which meant it was usually crawling with maggots and smelled awful. Yikes! Plus, the butchering process wasn't exactly sanitary. Imagine drinking someone else's spoiled milk, yikes. That was a reality in the Middle Ages. Milk often went to market with other goods, making it easy for thieves to swipe it. If caught, they faced harsh punishments, sometimes even being locked in a room with just the stolen milk to drink. Can you picture how awful that would be? To cover up the smell of spoiled meat, nobles went all out with expensive spices like cloves, cinnamon, and ginger, which were symbols of wealth. To make that meat last longer, cooks got creative, tossing in cheap, easy-to-store turnips. They were so popular that there was even a saying, "Turnips, a dish for kings." But after a while, people got sick of them. Legend has it that during King Henry VIII's reign, folks were so fed up with turnips that they actually petitioned him to ban them. Can you imagine? Everyone loves a bit of variety in their meals, and it turns out medieval folks were no different. Part 3, no sugar allowed. As we've covered, there was no refrigeration during the Middle Ages. Part 4, spoiled milk. Milk was another food that spoiled fast back in the day. Getting fresh milk in cities was tricky too. Eating during the Middle Ages was a risky business. Do you think you could handle eating medieval style? Part 2. Did you know people used to eat moldy cheese? Sure, we know now that some molds can make you sick, but back in the day, folks thought some actually made food taste better. But in the Middle Ages? What about the fish that was often so spoiled that its smell had to be hidden? During the Middle Ages, maggots in flour were just sifted out and used as usual. Milk was another food that spoiled fast back in the day. Getting fresh milk in cities was tricky too. To cover up the smell of spoiled meat, nobles went all out with expensive spices like cloves, cinnamon, and ginger, which were symbols of wealth. To make that meat last longer, cooks got creative. Drinking straight from rivers or wells was super common, with people thinking flowing water was clean enough. People even tried building latrines over rivers. Yeah, you heard that right. Sounds like a plan, but it backfired when the latrines collapsed. Salt was a luxury item, and people would use it sparingly, much like we would use gold today. Salt was extremely expensive. Food during the Middle Ages was bland, spoiled, and disgusting. Good evening, dear listener. Tonight, we return again to the forgotten history in search of stories around the world. I would love to know from where you tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Let's begin. Now, you might think that avoiding baths wouldn't be too hard in the winter months. But this couldn't be further from the truth. If you lived on a farm during the Middle Ages, you would have raised animals for 2 reasons. The first reason would be for labor. During the winter months, travel was one of the most dangerous things you could possibly do. If you were traveling by foot, you ran the risk of slipping on the ice and breaking your neck. If you were traveling by horse, you ran the risk of your horse slipping and crashing, which oftentimes meant that travelers would be crushed under the weight of their horse and cart. On top of this, the medieval remedy for icy roads was to cover them in sawdust. While this might seem like a good idea, in reality, it actually made things worse. See, when people would walk across these icy roads, their boots would pick up sawdust and carry it into their homes. There, the sawdust would then mix with their animals and make them sick. Oftentimes, this would lead to miscarriages, stillbirths, and infant deaths. On top of this, the sawdust would also get into people's eyes and make them go blind. And to top it all off, The sawdust would also get into people's food and make them very ill. Now you know why they called the Middle Ages the Dark Ages. See, animals like oxen and horses helped farmers plow fields and pull carts. As always, thank you so much for watching. The second reason, of course, was for food. However, during the winter months, feeding these animals became a costly affair. Grain was the primary food source for most livestock, but during the winter months, grain was scarce. You see, grain was often bought and sold by weight, and during the winter months, farmers had to weigh their grain multiple times to make sure they had enough to last them the whole year. If they found that they didn't have enough grain, they would then be forced to sell their extra grain at a loss or watch their animals starve. To avoid this fate, farmers would often slaughter their animals earlier than they would in modern times. This meant that the meat of these animals would last the farmers all winter, but it also meant that come spring, they wouldn't have the labor they needed to plant their crops. And so this would often lead to crop failures and widespread famine. People in the Middle Ages valued cleanliness very highly. In fact, they believed that bathing was the key to good health. Unfortunately, though, during the winter months, water froze almost immediately after it left your pipes or well. This meant that you couldn't bathe during the winter unless you wanted to take a freezing cold bath. Not only that, but frozen water expands and contracts as the temperature changes. This would cause the pipes to either burst or become very weak. Also, you'd have to constantly worry about frozen poop. See, human waste would frequently be dumped out of a window into the street below. It was usually done at night so that the stench wouldn't permeate throughout the entire house. But if the waste froze before it hit the ground, it could then be propelled into your neighbor's home when someone walked past and broke it. In the Middle Ages, winters were straight up deadly. Rats would invade your home. Frostbite was common even indoors, and you'd have to avoid bathing all winter because the water froze too fast. And these are only some of the many things that made medieval winters straight up deadly. Welcome back, everyone. Here are 5 ways medieval winters were straight up deadly. The first way medieval winters were straight up deadly was that rats would invade your house. When winter arrived in the Middle Ages, people's homes became a lot more crowded. When the temperatures dropped in the winter months, it wasn't just people who were at risk of getting frostbite, but also livestock. In order to protect their animals, farmers would bring them inside and keep them in their barns. The problem with this, however, was that the amount of heat produced by the animals would actually lower the amount of oxygen in the barn. And so if the farmers didn't check up on them regularly, many animals would suffocate and die. On top of this, if you were unfortunate enough to live in a home made of wattle and daub, which is a type of building material made of woven branches and mud, well, just one single ice crystal was enough to break through the roof. If this happened, your entire home would become an icebox practically overnight. And so people would do whatever they could to try and stay warm. Some people might not have been able to afford a fireplace or a good enough cloak to keep themselves warm. And so what did they do? Well, they started indoor ice baths. This might sound absolutely insane, but during the winter months, people would fill up a bucket with ice-cold water and submerge their entire body into it. They would do this to keep their blood vessels constricted, which would make them feel warmer overall. As you can imagine, though, this practice often led to frostbite. This is because during the winter months, rodents like mice and rats would sneak into people's homes to find both warmth and food. During the day, they would sleep near a warm hearth to get out of the cold. At night, they would then scurry around the home looking for food. The problem with this, however, was that rats carry diseases with them wherever they go. In the Middle Ages, the most common disease that they carried was the bubonic plague. It was estimated that during the winter months, around 25% of all rats carried the plague. So if rats were already getting into your home during the winter to look for food, Chances are you weren't going to be able to avoid contracting the plague if you lived through the winter. That is, of course, something you had to watch out for when you walked outside in the winter months. Because as we mentioned in our last video, people frequently died on the streets simply from being too cold. The second way medieval winters were straight up deadly was that frostbite was common even indoors. The third way medieval winters were straight up deadly was that you had to avoid bathing all winter long. The fourth way medieval winters were straight up deadly was that farmers had to slaughter their animals early. And the fifth way medieval winters were straight up deadly was... Welcome to part 3 of medieval winters were straight up deadly. In today's video, we will look at 5 reasons why medieval winters were straight up deadly. The period between 1300 and 1800 was known as the Little Ice Age. And while it wasn't really an ice age, it was definitely chilly. Winters during this time would often last for 6 months, which is twice the length of our average winter, so you can imagine how harsh they could be. People did not have enough supplies to last that long without the help of modern conveniences such as indoor heating. In most cases, this meant that the body was kept inside the home until spring arrived and the ground could be dug up again. It was very common for multiple generations of a family to die during a winter like this and be buried in the backyard. While they might not have been delicious, there were still ways to get calories and nutrients from non-traditional foods. During the winter of 1709, children in Russia started gnawing on tree bark to stave off hunger. A traveler wrote in his journal that the sight of kids eating pieces of wood was disgusting and disturbing. Bark was most likely a source of vitamin C, which is important to prevent scurvy. This was due to the fact that the heavy snowfall made it difficult for them to hunt. Starved and desperate, they sought out easier prey. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already, and come back soon for another awesome video. See you later, which meant that humans and their livestock were in danger. Entire flocks of sheep were wiped out as wolves moved in and feasted on the carcasses. This meant that people had less meat to eat during the winter and fewer resources to trade. In some cases, the wolves got bold enough to attack people. One old French manuscript described a terrifying encounter between a mother and daughter and a pack of ravenous wolves. The pair was traveling through the forest when they were set upon by the wolves. The mother fought back and managed to stab one of the animals with a sharp stick. She held off the rest of the pack while her daughter ran to safety. While the story may be exaggerated, it paints a clear picture of how dire things were getting. Animals didn't just attack people during the winter. Bears were known to break into houses and steal food. In some cases, they would refuse to leave and would stay in the house for the duration of the winter. When spring finally arrived, people would open up their doors and find bear droppings all over the floor. The bears would have eaten everything that they could find and then just stayed there until they died. It seemed like animals were trying to fight back against humans for taking away their food. Scurvy is a disease that causes bleeding gums and eventually leads to tooth loss. Without teeth, it becomes impossible to chew food, and people slowly waste away from lack of nutrition. To prevent this, people turned to less traditional sources of vitamins. In France, people sold the leather from shoes and gloves to tanneries and used the money to buy food. They took the leather shavings home and boiled them for hours to soften them up. Then they mixed the scraps with other foods to bulk them up. The same thing happened in Germany, but the people there had to boil the leather for 3 whole days to make it soft enough to eat. Children were given the scraps after the adults picked out the good stuff. In some cases, people were forced to sell their leather belts and shoes to stay alive. But those who had nothing left to sacrifice were forced to cut off strips of leather from their clothing and eat them raw. They were often buried together in mass graves, so that the living would be tempted to dig up the bodies and look at their loved ones. Sometimes they would leave trinkets or personal belongings of the deceased at the head of the grave so that the mourners could feel connected to them. Was not being able to leave your home for weeks at a time. During the winter of 1607, the French explorer Samuel de Champlain got stuck in Canada, and he described the experience in detail. He said that the wind was howling like a hungry wolf, and the temperature was dropping so fast that birds dropped out of the sky and froze to death. At one point, the explorers were snowed in for 2 whole weeks, and they had to stay by their fire the entire time to keep warm. If they stopped, they would probably freeze to death. The constant fear of hypothermia made it difficult to sleep. Every few minutes, Champlain and his crew had to get up and run around outside to keep the blood circulating. If that wasn't enough, icicles would form on the walls of their shelter and fall on them while they slept. All of their food was frozen solid, so they had to put it in the fire to thaw. When they finally managed to cook something, they had to eat it right away because there was no way to store it. The only entertainment they had was watching icicles melt and listening to the sounds of the blizzard. After 2 weeks, the sun finally came out and the ice melted. The explorers looked out of their shelter and found that everything was covered in a thick layer of ice. Once they realized that they had survived the ordeal, they all collapsed from exhaustion. During the winter of 1264, a young girl in Switzerland was accidentally buried alive. She was placed in the tomb with her family, and she survived for several days. Eventually, she managed to dig herself up, and she lived the rest of her life knowing that she cheated death. Her story was written down for future generations as a warning to always double-check if someone was actually dead before burying them. In more populated areas, people couldn't dig up the frozen ground to bury their dead, so bodies would just pile up on the streets. They would be covered over with snow, but people still had to avoid walking over them on the street. If you fell through the ice covering and touched a dead body, you were believed to be cursed for the rest of your life. Back then, it was believed that diseases were caused by an imbalance of the 4 humors. If you came into contact with a corpse, you would absorb their illness and be cursed with whatever they had. No one wanted to take the risk, so the piles of dead bodies were left alone until spring. Eventually, the towns became too overrun with corpses, and the authorities had to do something. They constructed large sheds to store the bodies in. One shed was built in Paris, and it was used to hold more than 100,000 corpses. What made the situation even more horrifying was that most of the people who died weren't even old or sick. They were healthy adults who succumbed to the bitter cold. For some parts of the world, winters were so bad that people would die from hypothermia or starvation before spring even arrived. Here are 5 ways medieval winters would kill you. Welcome to my channel. Number 5. Winter famine. Killed more than wars. It seems like every time we talk about the Middle Ages, we always mention how widespread famine was during this period. But what most people don't realize is that it wasn't just summer and fall harvests that were bad. Winter was just as difficult, if not worse. There wasn't any kind of reliable way to store food back then, and there was no refrigeration. So all of the food that was harvested had to be preserved by drying, salting, or smoking. Even then, it would only last so long. And many times, it just wasn't enough food to last through the winter. When the snow began to fall, it would bury the crops and make them inaccessible. It was also extremely hard to find work since most jobs relied on farming or trading, both of which shut down during the winter. This meant that most people didn't have the money to buy food when supplies started to dwindle. Food prices would go through the roof during these times, making it impossible for poor people to eat unless someone helped them. Many farmers lost everything during these winters, including their animals, which meant that come spring, they didn't have the resources to plant anything. In England, one particularly harsh winter almost led to the country descending into chaos because of how bad things got. King Edward III tried to intervene and help his people, but even he didn't have enough money to save everyone. Things were especially grim in Northern Europe, where people had to rely on the meager rations that they had stored up. During the winter of 1315, people in Denmark, Norway and Sweden survived by eating nothing but rye bread, which was made from ground-up animal bones. Needless to say, they didn't get much nutrition from that. And as soon as spring arrived, everyone emerged from their homes with serious cases of malnutrition. Overall, it is estimated that around 25 million people died because of the famine that occurred during the winter of 1315. To put that in perspective, that's about 10 times the number of people who died during World War I. Famines like this were common throughout the Middle Ages, but each one claimed more and more lives as the centuries passed. By the 1600s, winters were so cold that they started to affect the climate. Some summers were so warm after a particularly harsh winter that plants grew out of control. It was uncommon for farmers to walk up to their crops and find themselves waist-deep in foliage. Thanks for watching. Which of these winters would you rather experience? Let me know in the comments below.